Good morning. Good morning. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for their gracious invitation, and I am very honored to be here and have the opportunity to speak to you this morning. I am indebted to Marco Bischoff because he has now given a large part of my prepared talk, so I can fill in with perhaps some of the more exotic or less well-known aspects of our program. Let me begin by saying, once upon a time, in a land far away, a young undergraduate student approached the Dean of Engineering at Princeton University and asked him if he would supervise a project that she was considering as her independent research. He said, "Well, you should be speaking to your advisor about this." And she said, no, my advisor is not interested. He told me this has nothing to do with science. What she wanted to do was to construct a random number generator and see if people could affect it just by thinking about it. This type of research had been conducted by a physicist at Boeing Aircraft, Dr. Helmut Schmidt, and he had demonstrated that people could indeed affect the output of a random process. Well, Dean Jahn, or Bob, as I will refer to him. In fact, I should point out that you may not see him, but Bob is here with us today. He passed away a year and a half ago from the physical world, but he is still very much with me, and I know he is still very much involved and enthusiastic from whatever realm he is in at the moment, with the kind of work that we are doing and that all of us are doing, namely the study of consciousness. But let me return. So this student proposed this project to the dean, who said, "I don't know anything about these things, but it seems to me quite reasonable for an engineering student to design and construct a random event generator." And so he agreed to supervise the project. From a pedagogical perspective, they proceeded to do this little experiment. They built a small random event generator, carried out a few experiments, and discovered that indeed there were indications that people could affect the output of this device. He became very interested and very intrigued, now more about from a point of view of engineering. As the Dean of Engineering and as an aerospace scientist, he saw this phenomenon as having some important implications for his fields of study. And in the course of his career in aerospace engineering, he had made the acquaintance and indeed the friendship of a fellow Princeton alumnus, James McDonnell, who was the patriarch, if you will, of the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company. And in a conversation with Mr. McDonnell, he described the work that this student had done. And Mr. Mack said, "You know, I have been concerned about this phenomenon because sometimes our pilots report these unusual phenomena. We call them gremlins, where under conditions of tension and stress or excitement, sometimes the electronics malfunction in very strange ways. So I think that this topic should be studied. It should be studied more carefully. It should be studied at Princeton, and you should be the one to head the program. And if you set up a program to study this, I will fund it. Well, this is an offer that's very hard to refuse. And so Bob Jahn proceeded to address, talk to his administration at the university, which grudgingly gave him permission to do this work under some very careful constraints. They didn't like it very much, but in the interests of academic freedom, in which any tenured faculty member should be permitted to address any question that he or she wants, they said, okay, you can do this. He then went off to find me because he was busy being a dean and a professor and a researcher. He was a very busy man and could not run this laboratory on a day-to-day basis, and he needed somebody to help him with it. And so he was looking around and the people who were involved in these topics to see who was there who might work out. Okay, so meanwhile, while all this is going on in Princeton, I was living in the Chicago area, and after having left school to raise a family, I decided to return to school and finish my education. And in the course of doing that, like his student, I had to design an independent research project. I had recently read a paper by two physicists at Stanford Research Institute, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, who had described some experiments in what they called remote viewing. Remote viewing was a process whereby one individual over here would attempt to describe the location where another person was or would be at an assigned time without having any access to any sensory information about this location. And they had achieved some very significant results. I read this paper and thought, this looks interesting. I think I'd like to try it. And maybe I could make this an attempted replication of their work as my independent project, which I proceeded to do. And like Bob's student, I was seeing some very remarkable results where people were sometimes able to produce almost photographic descriptions of places they had no way of knowing about. So in 1978, I was invited to give a talk about my work at a conference. It happened that Bob Jahn was there trying to familiarize himself with the community and the research that was being conducted. And in the course of a coffee break right after my presentation, a colleague approached me and said, "Did you talk to Dean Jahn?" And I said, "Who is Dean Jahn?" And he said, "Oh, don't you know? This is the dean from Princeton University, and he's thinking about setting up a program. Maybe he wants to offer you a job." I said, "Oh, that would be nice. Can you introduce me?" And so he led me over to where Bob was standing, and we had our very first and very momentous exchange. I said to him, "I understand you've been looking for me." And he said, "You might say that." And that was the beginning of what became a beautiful and a friendship and a very productive collaborative career for the two of us. He had to, of course, get approval for my appointment to work at Princeton. The administration that was willing somewhat to allow him to do the work was not particularly enthusiastic about having a psychologist being a manager of an engineering laboratory. They sent me to be interviewed by the chairman of the psychology department, who in the course of this interview asked me whether I believed in this stuff. I said, well, I don't know if I believe in it, but I think there's enough evidence to indicate that this should be studied more carefully. He then wrote a report back to the committee and said this woman should not be permitted to study this topic because she believes in it. Eventually, after much back and forth, they finally agreed that they would allow me to have an appointment under the condition that we hired a real psychologist to come and work with us and make sure that I stayed honest. And that's how we found Roger.
Everyone.
So you will be here, after I speak, you will be hearing from a real psychologist and a very dear colleague. Anyhow, that was how the laboratory got started. It was officially set up in the basement of the engineering school in a little area outside the machine shop. It was just a store. It had been used for storage. I don't think anyone knew it was there. We arranged to have it expanded a bit. We had it decorated. We installed carpeting. We installed nice furniture, paneling on the walls. It became a very lovely and very comfortable, almost living room-like environment. The sofa had lots of stuffed animals. We had pictures on the walls, and we tried to make this a warm and friendly place to be. I emphasize that because as important as the rigor of the protocols and the analytical techniques, in this business we felt it was also very important that people should be comfortable and be enjoying themselves. So this was part of the program, and an important part. We had to submit our protocols for review by the Human Subjects Committee. They reviewed the protocols and they said, well, we can't find anything wrong with the procedures for the experiments, but it is essential that you take pains to make sure that your subjects do not suffer from delusions of metaphysical capabilities. Okay? So when we had our participants come to the lab to engage in the experiments, and I should mention all of the people who did our experiments were ordinary people. They were volunteers, they weren't paid, none of them claimed to have any rare, exceptional psychic abilities. In a sense, they were our co-experimenters, they were our colleagues. But sometimes they would come and they'd be a little bit nervous, okay? Imagine you're in the engineering school of engineering and applied science at Princeton, and you go down a flight of stairs, and then you turn to the right down a corridor leading to the machine shop, all stark white, and then there's a door, and you open the door, and suddenly you find yourself in a fairyland, and a room with, well, you saw a picture of it. It was a wonderful place. There was this big couch with the stuffed animals. On the other wall, there was this great big pinball machine that was a marvelous piece of kinetic sculpture as well as an experimental device. And people would come in and they'd be a little bit, where am I? What is this all about? And I'd invite them to sit down and explain the program. And I'd say, now, I have to inform you that no matter what happens in the course of these experiments, you must not leave here thinking you're God, unless, of course, you thought you were God when you arrived, in which case we don't want to disabuse you of that. Well, this made people laugh. Who wouldn't? And this was wonderful, because when they laughed, we had just shared a joke. It put them at ease. We were able to proceed, and I think this wonderful warning or caution actually served a very positive purpose in the long run. I don't believe that any of them thought they were God when they left, unless they thought they were when they arrived. But they did have a good time, and this was an important part of the program. Now, the program itself, as Marco pointed out, really had three components. One of them was the design of analytical techniques and strategies to evaluate the information that was achieved in the remote viewing experiments. So instead of just having somebody look at the descriptions of the locations and say, gee, that looks like a pretty good match, instead they'd be given a list of questions. Well, is the scene indoors or outdoors? Is it colorful or drab? Is it noisy or quiet? And there would be 30 of these descriptors that people would apply to the description and to the actual target. And then we had algorithms that were able to calculate the probability of the information that was acquired being due to chance or being information that was beyond just guessing. The second part and the larger part of the program was this series of experiments in what we called human-machine interactions, whereby various types of random physical devices were used as tools, everywhere from a microscopic random event generator based on electronic noise, the tunneling of electrons in a thing. Right. Well, electron tunneling, I'm sorry. Or this great big macroscopic mechanical cascade that sat on the wall of one room. We had a fountain where the pulsation of the water, that was our random variable. We had a pendulum where the damping rate was the random process. But all of these were, it's important, these were all designed by our colleague John Bradish, and they were all beautiful. It was art, and they were delightful to interact with. And so people would come. Our intention was to try to get them to come back more frequently, because we felt that since we were not studying the people but the machines, we wanted each person to generate as large a database as they could. And I can just very briefly summarize some of the results. Obviously, if you want me to continue talking for 2 days, I can give you as much detail as you want. But given the limited time, let me just go down some of the findings. Okay, the largest database that we accumulated was on our microelectronic random event generator, or random number generator. This was a more sophisticated version of the device that had originally been designed by this undergraduate some years before. And basically it was just a kind of a box, maybe the size of a microwave oven, okay, like so. It had LED displays that produced numbers that you could look at, and it was connected to a computer that took that output and could produce either graphic or numerical displays for the operator's feedback. The operator would generate trials of 100 bits each, 200 bits each, where you had 200 digits, ones and zeros, that were random, and by chance you'd expect to see 100 of each, right? You'd expect a mean of 100 heads and 100 tails. Now, of course, if you flip 200 coins, you're not always going to get 100 heads. You might get 105 heads. You might get 92 heads. But if you do it often enough, you will end up with a mean of this distribution function that will be at about 100. And indeed, this is what we had in calibration mode. Okay, so people would come here, they would sit there, they would attempt to get more high numbers or more low numbers. And it might display on the screen as a graph similar to the one that Marco put up. And just in summary, we did many tens of millions of these trials by a couple of hundred people who participated. And what resulted was a very small effect that was consistent and repeated over and over and over again, so that statistically speaking, the mean of that distribution function had shifted in the same direction that people were intending. We looked at whether people were assigned, told the order of the intentions, now go high, now go low, now do a baseline. That is, don't do anything, just let it run under the same conditions. That didn't seem to make much difference. We looked at whether if people generated each trial with a single button push or whether they generated 1,000 trials with one button push. That didn't seem to make much difference. We moved the operator away from the machine into the next room, into the next city. In some cases, in global distances away from where the machine was, thousands of miles. Didn't make any difference, no matter how far the person was from the machine. We had the person in generating their intention at times other than the time the machine was running. Okay, we're going to run the machine tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Maybe you want to send your intention out today. Or maybe you're too busy and you don't do it until, next Thursday. That didn't matter either. This is very puzzling and really very difficult to understand or to explain from any known scientific model. We also discovered that people tended to do best on their first attempt, the beginner's luck phenomenon. The biggest effects were in the first trials or the first series. People came in, they had no idea what to expect. They did the thing, they got a result, and they went, oh, this is easy. I'll do it again. Well, the next time they tried it and they thought they knew what they were doing, it didn't work. So now they're back into this state of uncertainty, okay, that they were at when they first came in, and the effect recovered. And it turned out that if we had them each, come back for at least 5 different series, the results did recover, not as strong as the first effort, but gradually, and they accumulated to overall significant results. We also found differences between male and female operators. Male operators tended to get results that were pretty well correlated with what they intended. However, the effects were very tiny. Female operators got much larger effects, but they didn't show a very consistent correlation with their intentions. This led us to do a series of experiments we called co-operator experiments, where we had 2 people working together with a shared intention. Okay? What we found there was unexpected. If the 2 people were the same sex, 2 men or 2 women, the results were pretty much what you'd expect by chance, even if those individuals had been able to achieve good results individually. If they were of opposite sex, the results they achieved was about twice as large as we saw for individual operators. Most interestingly, though, was if the opposite sex pairs happened to be a loving couple, their results were about 7.5 times larger than what we would expect. This was a totally unexpected phenomenon, but it was consistent with something that we kept hearing from our participants over and over again, namely, intention is only part of the process. You have to have an intention, but it needs more than that. you have to have a sense of connection, a sense of resonance with the device or the process that was going on. Very often we would hear this, well, you know, it's true, our primary variable was intention. And it's pretty simple to design an experiment where you say, okay, now go high, now go low. But you can't say, now love the machine, now don't love the machine. I mean, that's a very different, a much more difficult assignment. But what we could do was we could design these small, I think you had a picture, these portable random event generators that one could attach to a small palm-top computer and take into the field, into environments where there might be a natural feeling of resonance. I'm sure most of you have had that experience. You go to a theater, you go to a concert, you might be at a religious service or a meditation group where everybody is kind of on the same wavelength. And we would take these devices to these different locations, and we would also take them to more pedestrian situations, you know, a business meeting, a classroom lecture. And what we discovered, that even though no one knew the random event generator was there, except the person who brought it, when the environment and the group of people were all in tune, when they were all on the same wavelength, so to speak, the random event generator was producing a more ordered sequence of digits than it was in boring or mundane situations. And this, we did a large number of these experiments, and this field having the double meaning of both something you take into the field and something that might be measuring a field of some sort, became the basis of Roger's project, which he'll be talking about next. So anyway, that was basically the empirical part of the PEAR program. We also had another portion that really involved a theoretical effort to try to explain what was going on. This was a challenge because what we were seeing in the experiments was inconsistent with any known scientific process. We couldn't explain it, but something was happening. What was it? You know, very early on in the course of doing this research, we realized that although initially we had set out to see whether modern engineering technology was vulnerable to some anomalous influence of the human operators, it didn't take very long for us to realize we were looking at something much more profound, something much more important. We were studying the role of consciousness in the creation of physical reality. And this, of course, was the subtitle of the book that we wrote in 1987 that described the first 8 years of our program. It was called Margins of Reality, the Role of Consciousness in the Physical World. And we looked at a number of different possibilities of how one might model or explain what was going on. It was quite a challenge because nothing really worked. Nothing that we knew scientifically was going to explain this. But eventually, you know, you collect more data, you collect more experience, you exclude this hypothesis or that one. We talked about the scientific two-step, a dance in which the scientist moves from experiment to theory. You do the experiment, you accumulate evidence, you then try to explain the evidence in some kind of model. That model now informs the next level of experiment, and so forth. And this iteration continues back and forth over as many times as you can. We did come up with a few models. I don't think I'm going to have time to go into those, but I'd be happy to just talk about that to anyone who's interested. There is one other thing I might tell you, though, because our program was, while it involved rigorous science and very careful protocols, you have to understand that when you're dealing in a hostile environment, which we were, you had to be very careful. I forget, I think it may have been Friedrich Nietzsche who once observed that one should love one's enemies because they bring out the best in you. And so when you know that people are waiting for you to make a mistake, you're very careful not to. So this work was very good. It was rigorous. Bob and I, and I'm sure Roger and the other members of our staff, would all put our confidence, endorse the rigor and the honesty of these experiments. What was coming out of them was something that was very puzzling. And in the course of it, there were other dimensions of the program that I'd like to share with you, a couple of them, because they were fun. And they, for example, how did we get the name PEAR? Okay. Well, when we first started the laboratory, as I said, we were in a storage area. It had no room number, no name. We referred to it as the lab. And to identify it to people who were looking for us, we put a Greek letter psi on the door. We thought this would be acceptable because the Greek psi stands for psychology, it stands for psychic phenomena, it stands for wave function, you know. Well, so the Greek psi is on the door, and by the time the third or fourth person came by asking us why we had a devil's pitchfork on our door, we said, this is interesting, but if this is scaring people, we better take the devil's pitchfork down. We then put up a little chart. It was a picture of a spiral galaxy with an arrow. It said, "You are here." Okay? Well, one day I came into work and there's this fellow standing there, you know, glaring at this picture, and he said, "You know, that's not our galaxy." And I said, "Really? I'm really glad you pointed that out. I'd hate to have a misleading sign on the door." I tore it down, I went in, and I said, "This place is crazy. These folks they think we're nuts." Well, shortly after that, Bob and I decided we really had to get a name for the laboratory. So one day we were out having lunch, and he said, "You know, I've been giving some thought to a name. What do you think about Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research?" "PEAR?" I said. "PEAR? It doesn't grab me. I'm sure we can come up with something more elegant than that." And Bob said, "Why? What's wrong with pear? It's a lovely fruit." And it's. I said, "No, Bob, I don't think pear will do it." Meanwhile, the waitress has brought our lunch. Bob says, "Would you pass the salt?" And I go to reach for the salt shaker, and I'm holding a pewter pear. No, I'm sorry. Okay. We talked some more, couldn't come up with any other ideas. The waitress comes back at the end and takes the plates away. "Can I interest you folks in some dessert? We have some lovely fresh pear cake." Now, I don't know about you guys, but that was the first and last time I ever encountered the idea of pear cake. And at this point, I realized I was outmaneuvered. I mean, you can't fight that. Because if I said no and we went out, I'd probably get hit in the head with a pear. I mean, and so PEAR became the name of our laboratory. And so instead of a devil's pitchfork and a misleading spiral galaxy, we now put a pear on the door. And apparently this didn't bother anybody. And that was how we became the PEAR Lab. PEAR attracted a great number of visitors. Some of them were motivated to try to learn something. Others were motivated by trying to teach us something. Some of them were motivated by trying to find out what we were doing wrong. And we actually had a lot of fun. Some people were just great. We had young people who came and stayed with us for several days or even months. as interns, volunteer because we weren't allowed to have students as part of the program, but as volunteers who came, you know, that was our business and theirs, and they were great. Many of them helped us design new experiments. They helped us with some of the analyses of the data that we had. I also need to mention that, speaking of people, our lab staff involved more than Roger, Bob, and me. We had York Dobbins, who was a theoretical physicist as a part of our staff, John Bradish, who was an electrical engineer who designed and constructed many of the experiments, Arnold Lettieri, a psychologist who really helped with the communications, talking to people, answering mail, and off and on different people who came to visit, to volunteer. But the interesting part was we were a very small space, okay? This storage room that had now been broken into 5 little rooms. And we had a number of people who all came from very different disciplines. Now, you can't very often put a group of people, particularly a group of men, in an environment where they all are coming with a totally different perspective and, you know, without running into territorial problems. But we had no option. At one point, the university switched to a different phone system, and they had these phones that they wanted to install, where if you pick it up, would say, if you want to speak to Brenda Dunne, press 1. If you want to speak to Roger Nelson, press 2. Da, 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 da. And we said, we don't really need that. And this woman on the phone said, what do you mean you don't? I mean, aren't you, you know, you're living in the modern age. You know, what do you do when you get a phone call for Roger Nelson? I yell out, hey, Roger, telephone. It works pretty well. But this dynamic was an important part of the program. We each brought some skill, some point of view to the work that complemented. We recently had a meeting, a conference of the Society for Scientific Exploration on the topic of consilience. And of course, this is what you folks are doing, trying to bring different points of view together to bear on a common question, named what is consciousness? What is the role of consciousness in reality? And we did this on a small scale. We had this arrangement, this small group of people who worked together. We were all good friends. Some days, like in all friendships, we'd get on each other's nerves. But most of the time, I think Roger will agree, we got along pretty well. And more importantly, this dynamic of multi-perspectives, of different points of view, from different people in close proximity, all sharing the same phone line, was a very important part of the background of the phenomenon. I once did a little calculation based on my calendar, and I found that in the periods of time when our staff and our visitors were all in residence, we seemed to be getting the best results. So it wasn't just the intention, it wasn't just the human operator, it was also the staff, it was the environment. All of these things were playing into the production of these anomalies. And the more we thought about the anomalies and tried to come up with a model for them, we thought, well, you can't explain this by any physical model. There's no physical theory that can explain the lack of attenuation over distance and time. Can't do that. There's no psychological model that can address this in any productive way. But there is one area that is intriguing. I'm not putting it forward as an answer, just as a question, but somewhere in nature one does see a process whereby a very tiny effect that's almost unobservable in and of itself, but can compound over many millions of efforts to create a distribution that has shifted ever so slightly. a phenomenon whereby the relationship between the genders of the participants might have some influence. Evolution, perhaps? Perhaps we're looking at a system that's more of a biological process than a cognitive one. In fact, we wrote a paper called "Is Consciousness the Life Force?" And indeed, we published a book with the title of "Being and Biology: Is Consciousness the Life Force?" And again, there's somebody watching my time because I'm not looking. But let me leave off for a moment. How much? 5 minutes? 10? Oh, okay. I was going to shift a little bit to talking about ICRL, which was an outgrowth, along with the Global Consciousness Project, of the PEAR program. In the mid-1990s, we realized that sooner or later we were going to have to close the program down for one reason or another. The reason was never because the university shut us down. There were people who claimed that that was it. That was not. If the university could have closed us down, they would have done so in the first 2 years. We were getting bored. There were just so many things we could do and had so many questions we could ask. We couldn't talk about the participants, for example. We couldn't ask questions. I mean, this was an engineering program, and we had to stay within that very carefully defined definition. But we had been interacting with colleagues in different parts of the world, including Fritz Popp here in Germany. We had a colleague in England, Paul Devereaux. We had a colleague in Russia. We had a number of people that we got together with every year or so just to share our work and see where there might be some commonalities among them. And we came to call this little group the International Consciousness Research Laboratories. When it became clear in 2005 or so that it was time to close the PEAR Lab, Bob was about to move on to retirement from his professorship. We would have to have a full-time professor from the department to oversee the program. There was nobody who would do that. And so we thought about what do we do next. And we established, we took our informal ICRL consortium and we incorporated it as an official nonprofit organization. We built a community that we came to call the Pear Tree, which really covered probably 60 or 70 people from different parts of the world who had been involved or interested in our work. We have a couple of friends from the Pear Tree here today joining us. We've got one from Belgium, we've got another one from the Netherlands, and I mean, but this spanned a very broad spectrum of people. And when we closed the PEAR laboratory, we then shifted to functioning from ICRL, which gave us a little bit more freedom to ask questions and to talk about these topics with other people. I should also mention that PEAR had a great deal of difficulty publishing its work. This is true of almost any scientific endeavor that challenges the established mainstream. The idea of peer review is it's a nice term in principle, but it doesn't work in practice. We could not get our papers published. We could not present our work at professional society meetings. And so we became involved in creating a organization we called the Society for Scientific Exploration, or SSE. SSE just recently celebrated, I guess it was its 38th or something annual meeting, and they meet in different parts of the U.S. every year and alternate years in Europe. And it's a forum for people who have an interest in topics that are outside of the mainstream, to get together, to share their research, to talk about it, to ask questions, and to learn. Roger used to have a little card with an expression I always loved. It said, "Enjoy yourself or try to learn something. You will annoy someone." Well, we were very good at annoying people, but we also enjoyed ourselves, and I think we learned a lot. And the SSE in this interdisciplinary forum provided an opportunity where you could go and hear someone talk about some other kind of anomaly that maybe pushed your boundaries. UFO abductions, I don't know. The Loch Ness Monster? Well, maybe. And then as you're listening to people talking about, you know, these other topics, reincarnation, alternative healing, you find yourself thinking, you know, I'm listening to this with some skepticism. That's how people are listening to me. And I can remember one year a colleague from SSE who was very much into UFOs got up and he gave a talk and he said, you know, this stuff, his UFOs, this is real. I mean, we have evidence, there's no question. This ESP business, I don't know about that. And I thought, that's interesting. That's sort of how I feel about your work. But you know, we were communicating. And eventually you start finding these similarities, these connections that may inform each other. Because it's like the old story, you know, of the blind men with the elephant. You've probably heard this, where these blind men approach this elephant and they're each trying to describe it. And one of them grabs the leg and said, oh, it's sort of like a tree trunk. And the other one grabs the tail and says, no, it's like a rope, and so forth. Well, you can't describe the elephant by its parts. You have to find a way to integrate those parts and those different perspectives to get a better picture of what it is you're studying. And when your topic is consciousness, you have to remember that any field of study is an act of consciousness. Consciousness is what divides psychology from physics, the humanities from biology. There's no separation in the real world. It's just a cognitive distinction that's made, that's created. And once we make these distinctions, we sort of can narrow our focus, but then we forget that it's just one leg of the elephant. There's a lot more that goes with it. And I have been a big fan of interdisciplinary approaches to topics, especially the topic of consciousness. One might be able to understand a bit about consciousness by looking at the pieces that make it up, but you're never going to understand it from within that particular piece, because it's only a part of it. And everything that we do in science, well, in fact, in anything, any activity that humans involve themselves in involves consciousness, okay? Just like the scientific two-step, human experience has a two-step. We have a direct experience, and then we have a description of that experience, okay? Science is a description of that experience, of subjective experiences. It's a way we can say, hey, you know, I was out in the field the other day and I saw this magnificent sunset and I was really moved by the, you know, but I can't share that with somebody else until I'm able to put it into words, which are never adequate, but it's an attempt. And it's this translation into words that is what consciousness does. And this is what we have to recognize. All of these distinctions, even things like time and space, are constructions of consciousness, which, as Albert Einstein once pointed out, keeps everything from happening all at once. And when everything happens all at once and you get away from all your distinctions, you're back there in what you might call the quantum field or the Akashic record or whatever. All that exists now is potential. And then as a complement to this potential, you have an organizing principle that draws from this potential and creates a reality. We can call that organizing principle consciousness. Anyway, I think that pretty well covers. I could go into more detail about different portions of our program, but I hope I've been able to give you a sense of who we were at PEAR, what we did, and how we did it. And we are just very happy that you folks have an interest in this, and we're delighted to share it with you. So thank you. Okay?
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Do you need...
It was very enjoyable to just see you and feel your presence here, and just talk so personally about your. I think it's really a big part of your life, this research,
yes.
Isn't it?
Well, it was altogether close to 40 years if you combine ICRL and PEAR. So it was a long time.
Yeah, and
I was actually a mere baby when we started.
No, I appreciate it very, very, very much, especially in the beginning when you said that Professor Jahn, he's still here, and he's
yes.
still. I remember when we heard about his passing away. I think it was very shortly before 2017, our conference here, and we were thinking about him, and so. Yeah, he started, or you together started something amazing. I like how you present it just as a phenomenon. You don't immediately give an explanation. I think that's
don't have an explanation.
Yes, I mean, one is always tempted to have a theory about it, and I think most of the people here. They could very much relate to what you were talking about when you talked about the relationship to the machine. Mm-hmm. Because most of these people work with machines which have 3 random generators built in. Uh-huh. And isn't it, I think when Brenda talked about relationship to the machine, many of you thought she's talking about time waver. When I read in one of your books, you were describing what's the best relationship to the machine you can have to have a good result, isn't it? And love. I love my machine.
You can't say love in the scientific world, but you can say resonance.
Resonance. Much better.
Yeah. Well, it also keeps people from attacking you. Resonance is a very acceptable scientific term. And when you think about what it means love.
It does.
It means being on the same wavelength, right?
Wonderful.